The town of Craven Hollow held its breath for a spectacle. And the spectacle they were about to get wasn't the one they were paying for. The auction block was a rickety stage of splintered wood, stained with sweat and something darker. On it stood a man, or what was left of one. He was a giant, built like a mountain oak, but his branches had been savaged. His beard was a tangled nest of dirt and dried blood. His shirt, once probably a fine linen, was torn to ribbons, revealing a canvas of muscle and scars. But it was his wrists that drew the eye. They were raw, rubbed down to bleeding meat, where the iron shackles bit into his skin with every ragged breath he took. He was a caged animal, and the crowd was hungry. They called him the Bear of Craven Hollow, a name whispered in taverns and over sewing circles, a name that carried the weight of fear and folklore. They said he was a monster, a creature from the wild woods who didn't belong among civilized folk. And now he was for sale. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a rat-like smile, smacked his gavel against the post. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Strong back, can haul timber, plow a field till the sun gives out. Won't give you no lip, I guarantee you that." He winked, and a ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. "Let's start the biddin' at $5. Silence. Not even the town's most ruthless landowners wanted this kind of trouble. The man was too big, too wild. His eyes, when he bothered to lift them, held a stillness that was more terrifying than any rage. It was the stillness of a deep, dark forest, where things get lost and are never found again. "Come on now, folks! A bargain at $5! The auctioneer pleaded, his smile faltering. A man near the front, chewing on a wad of tobacco, spat a brown stream into the dust. $3, and that's for the sport of seeing him whipped." A few more snickers. The auctioneer sighed, ready to cut his losses. It was more of a disposal than a sale anyway. Get the beast out of the town jail before he tore the door off its hinges. And that's when a hand went up. It was a small hand, slender and pale, belonging to a woman standing at the edge of the crowd. She was wrapped in a simple gray shawl, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Mira, the widow, a woman who kept to herself, a ghost in her own life since her husband, Levi, had passed 2 winters ago. The crowd turned as one, their expressions shifting from bored cruelty to disbelief. They laughed. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a full-throated roar of mockery. A woman? Bidding on him. Mira didn't flinch. She didn't lower her hand. Her gaze was locked on the man in chains, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. The auction block, the jeering crowd, the hot sun beating down. It all faded away. There was only the broken giant and the quiet woman with an unreadable expression in her eyes. The auctioneer blinked, utterly confused. "Ma'am? You can't be serious. He ain't fit for housework, I can tell you that." She said nothing. She just nodded once, her chin held high. The gesture was small, but it carried the force of a landslide. $3. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. A stunned pause fell over the square. The man who had made the first bid stared at her, his mouth hanging open. The auctioneer looked from her to the man on the block, then back again. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, but a bid was a bid. He licked his lips, his beady eyes darting around. $3 going once, going twice. He slammed the gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Sold! To the widow Mira!" A collective groan rippled through the crowd. They had been cheated of their entertainment. They wanted to see the beast broken, not bought. Mira ignored them all. She moved forward with a steady, determined grace, her small coin purse already in her hand. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't meet the curious, judging eyes that followed her every step. She simply walked up to the auctioneer, counted out 3 dull coins into his sweaty palm, and turned to face her purchase. He was even taller up close. A mountain of a man, radiating a raw, untamed energy that made the air around him feel thick and heavy. He still didn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point somewhere over her shoulder, his chest rising and falling in slow, powerful rhythm. The sun glinted off the dried blood in his beard, a stark reminder of the violence he had endured. "Bring him to the wagon," Mira said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable authority. The auctioneer's men, two brutish boys who had been eager to use their whips just moments before, now looked hesitant. They shoved the man forward, and he stumbled, his bare feet scraping against the rough ground. He caught his balance with a fluid strength that was startling, and then walked, his shackles clinking a mournful song with each step. Mira followed him, her back straight, her face a mask of stone. The town was already forgetting them, turning its attention to the next bit of sad drama, a pregnant woman trying to sell her wedding ring. By the time they reached Mira's small, weathered wagon at the edge of town, the mountain man had gone still again, silent as a granite boulder. Mira untied the lead rope from the horse and gestured with her head toward the back of the wagon. "Get in." He didn't move. He just stood there, his immense presence a silent challenge. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Mira's face. What had she done? "I won't ask you twice," she said, her voice low and tight. She didn't know where the strength came from, but it was there. He seemed to consider her for a long moment, his dark eyes finally, briefly meeting hers. Then, with a surprising lack of effort, he climbed into the back of the wagon. Mira didn't wait. She climbed onto the driver's seat and snapped the reins. The wheels creaked in protest as they began to roll, leaving the noise and judgment of Craven Hollow behind. They turned toward the woods, toward the long, winding path that led to her isolated cabin, a place where secrets could be kept. The journey was a long one, filled with a silence that was heavier than any conversation. The man didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He didn't shift his weight or even seem to breathe too loudly. He just sat there, staring straight ahead with that same unnerving stillness. It crawled under Mira's skin, a quiet so profound it felt more dangerous than any threat of violence. She gripped the reins until her knuckles were white, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had bought a monster, and now she was taking him home. By the time the last rays of sunlight were bleeding through the trees, they reached her cabin. It wasn't much. One room, a sloped roof that leaked in the rain, and a fence that was more suggestion than barrier. It was a place of solitude, a place of grief. And now, it was a place with a giant in the yard. She pulled the wagon to a halt and slid down from the seat, her legs unsteady. She opened the cabin door and pointed inside, not looking at him. "There's water in the basin and a cot in the corner. You can have the cabin." She paused, her voice hardening. "I'll sleep in the barn." He didn't move from the wagon. He just watched her. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. "Look," she said, finally turning to face him, the last of her courage fraying. "I don't owe you kindness, but I don't owe you cruelty either. This is it. Take it or leave it." She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on him, on the cabin, on the insane decision she had made, and walked toward the small, dilapidated barn. She lit a single lamp, the flame flickering and dancing, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She didn't bother with a blanket. She just curled up on a bale of hay, the scratchy texture a comfort against her cheek, and for the first time since she had raised her hand in the town square, Mira exhaled. A long, shuddering breath that carried the weight of the entire day. Her body ached. Her hands were blistered from gripping the reins too tightly. And her hair, her dark, tangled hair, was still braided, a task she had performed with shaking fingers before the sun had even risen, preparing for a day she could never have predicted. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves. She listened for the sound of footsteps, for the creak of the cabin door, for any sign of the silent giant. But there was nothing, only the wild, lonely darkness. And in that darkness, a terrifying question began to form in her mind. Had she just saved a man, or had she brought her own doom right to her doorstep? The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn wall, painting stripes of gray across the hay-strewn floor. Mira woke with a start, her body stiff and cold. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings of the barn confusing her. Then, memory came crashing back, the auction, the man, the silence. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. He was in her cabin. A violent stranger, a man the whole town feared, was just a few dozen yards away, sleeping in her bed. She had been a fool, a reckless, sentimental fool. She should have left him chained. She should have run. Slowly, cautiously, she rose from the hay bale, brushing the straw from her dress. She crept to the barn door and peered through a narrow crack. Her eyes scanned the small yard, expecting she didn't know what. A broken door? The man gone, along with her few meager possessions? But the cabin door was wide open. It swung gently in the morning breeze. He was gone. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. He had taken the shelter for the night and left. It was the best possible outcome. She was safe. She was alone again. But then she saw him. He wasn't gone. He was sitting on the edge of her small porch, as calm and still as a statue. He was facing the rising sun, his broad back to her, his massive shoulders relaxed. And something was wrong with the picture. It took her a moment to realize what it was. The shackles were gone. They weren't on his wrists. They were lying on the porch beside him, a neat coil of heavy, dark iron. He had freed himself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He had been free all night. While she slept, defenseless in the barn, he had possessed the strength and skill to break his bonds. He could have left. He could have disappeared back into the woods he came from, or he could have come into the barn. He could have done anything to her. Her breath caught in her throat. She stayed frozen behind the barn door, watching him. He didn't seem to be planning on leaving. He just sat there, watching the world wake up, as if he belonged on her porch, as if he had sat there every morning of his life. The fear from the night before returned, but this time it was different. It was colder, sharper. This wasn't the fear of a caged beast. This was the fear of the unknown. Who was this man who could break iron but chose to stay? And that's when she saw the second thing. On the porch railing, right next to where he sat, was a small, familiar object. It was her hairbrush, polished wood and boar bristles, an intensely personal item she kept on the small shelf beside her cot. He had been inside her room. He had gone through her things. A cold dread trickled down her spine. He had stood in her space, breathed her air, touched her possessions. She scanned the porch, the yard, her mind racing. Nothing else was out of place. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Just the brush, sitting there like a strange, silent offering. It was clean, polished even. A few long strands of her own dark hair were still tangled in the bristles, a stark and intimate detail that made her stomach clench. She took a deep breath, forcing steel into her spine, and pushed the barn door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet morning. The man on the porch didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he had been expecting her. She walked across the yard, her bare feet cold against the damp earth. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her eyes fixed on him. "You touch my things," she said. Her voice was low, but it didn't tremble. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just continued to stare at the trees, his legs braced wide, his arms resting on his knees. He looked like an ancient king surveying his domain. The raw, bloody flesh of his wrists was a stark contrast to his powerful composure. Mira climbed the steps, her gaze never leaving him. She forced herself to stand close, to not show the fear that was fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. "Why didn't you run?" she asked, her voice tight. "Those chains are off. There's nothing keeping you here." Still nothing. The silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. She studied him, really looked at him for the first time, not as a beast or a purchase, but as a man. His face was rough, weathered by sun and hardship. His brow was shadowed, hiding his thoughts. But his eyes, they weren't wild, they weren't cruel, they were tired, so incredibly tired. They were soaked in a sadness so ancient and heavy, it seemed to weigh him down from the inside. He looked like a man who had seen too much, endured too much, and was now just done. She reached out and picked up the hairbrush. The wood was smooth and cool in her hand. She clutched it like a talisman, a piece of herself that he had touched and returned. Without another word, she turned and walked back into her cabin, the brush held tight in her fist. She should have been terrified. He was twice her size, a silent stranger with a violent reputation who had already proven he could break free of any restraint. But as she stood in the middle of her small, sparse cabin, she felt no danger, only a swirling storm of questions. That night, the air grew colder. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the wooden walls. Mira couldn't settle. The man, the bear, had spent the day in a state of unnerving quiet, moving from the porch to the edge of the woods, where he simply stood for hours, watching the trees as if waiting for a sign. He hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk, hadn't made a single sound. Mira found herself on the porch steps, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Her hair, which she hadn't touched since yesterday's hurried braid, was a mess of knots and tangles. It felt heavy, a reflection of the chaos in her mind. She pulled the braid loose, and her hair fell down her back like a thick, unruly rope. She tried to work through the snarls with her fingers, but it was a hopeless task. The strands caught and twisted, resisting her efforts. With a sigh of frustration, she let her hands fall into her lap. She was too tired, too worn down to fight even her own hair. And then she felt it. A shadow fell over her from behind, a presence, large and silent. She froze, her entire body going rigid. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it. The quiet was over. The violence was about to begin. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. She felt a hand, calloused and rough, but impossibly slow, reach over her shoulder. She didn't move. She didn't even breathe. The hand didn't touch her skin. It moved past her, down to her lap, where her own hands lay trembling. Gently, so gently, he took the hairbrush from her limp fingers. Mira's eyes snapped open. She didn't dare turn around. She could feel him move behind her, could hear the soft rustle of his clothes as he sat down on the porch step directly behind her, cross-legged. And then he began to brush her hair. The first stroke was a shock. It was deliberate, slow, and careful. He wasn't yanking or pulling. He was working through the knots with a patience that was almost reverent. She could feel the care in it, in the way he held the brush, in the steady, rhythmic motion. Each stroke was a question, and her stillness was the answer. She closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't in fear. It was in surrender. She let her shoulders slump, let the tension drain from her neck. She let him work. The knots began to unravel, one by one. The pull was never harsh, never painful. He separated the strands as if they were spun from silk, as if they were something sacred. It was the most intimate touch she had experienced in years, and it was coming from a man whose name she didn't even know, a man everyone else saw as a monster. When the last of the tangles was gone, her hair hanging smooth and heavy down her back, he paused. She thought he was finished. But then he gathered the hair in his large hands and separated it into 3 equal sections. Over, under, over again. His fingers, which she had seen wrapped in chains and stained with blood, moved with a surprising sureness. He was braiding her hair. Mira sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, confused, and powerful emotion rising in her chest. No one had braided her hair since her mother, when she was just a small girl. Not her friends, not her aunts, not even her husband, Levi. It was a simple domestic act, yet in that moment, it felt like a profound and sacred ritual. She swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The braid grew longer, tighter, more perfect with each pass of his hands. When he reached the end, he secured it with a small bit of twine he produced from a pocket. He tucked the end of the braid gently against her back, and then he rose. His shadow disappeared, and she heard the soft sound of his bare feet walking away, back toward the barn. He hadn't touched her skin, not once. Mira sat there on the porch steps for a long time, stunned into silence. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She wasn't crying from sadness or fear. She was crying because for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, someone had handled her with care. Someone had seen the tangled mess she was, and without a word, had gently, patiently, made something whole again. She reached back, her fingers touching the neat, tight braid. The bear of Craven Hollow, the silent, terrifying giant, had just shown her more tenderness than she had known in years. And as she sat there under the vast, starry sky, she realized she knew nothing at all about the man she had bought for $3. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. The man, the one the town called a beast, became a quiet fixture on her small, forgotten homestead. He never slept in the cabin. He never asked for food. He never spoke a single word. He rose with the sun each morning, his massive form a silhouette against the dawn, and he would walk the perimeter of her overgrown field. He moved with a quiet purpose, his eyes scanning the dilapidated fences, the sagging gate, the encroaching wilderness. And then he began to work. Mira watched him from the kitchen window, a dish towel clutched in her hands. She saw him brace a leaning fence post with a large rock. She saw him drag heavy, fallen branches from the path, his muscles bunching and releasing with an easy, powerful grace. He was repairing her world, piece by piece, and no one had asked him to. He worked like a man who had once built more than he had broken, his hands moving with a memory of creation. The first morning after the braiding, she left a bowl of beans and a piece of cornbread on the porch rail. She didn't know if he would take it. She expected to find it cold and untouched when she returned. But by noon the bowl was empty, sitting cleanly on the rail. There was no thank you, no nod of acknowledgement. There was just the quiet understanding that passed between two people who owed each other nothing, and yet were beginning to offer something anyway. The braid stayed in her hair for 2 more days. She couldn't bring herself to undo it. It felt like a brand, a secret mark of the tenderness she had been shown. She found herself reaching up, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern, feeling the knot of twine he had tied. It wasn't tight, just careful. The town's judgment, however, was not so careful. When Mira made her weekly trip to the trading post for supplies, the whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. A traveling peddler had seen the mountain man chopping wood outside her cabin, and the story had spread like wildfire. Heard the widow tamed the beast. Tamed him? Bet she keeps him chained at night where he belongs. That brute, she's a fool. She'll end up dead by winter. Mira kept her eyes forward. She tightened her shawl, paid for her salt and her soap, and walked out of the store without looking back. Their words were like stones, but they couldn't break the strange new peace that had begun to settle in her heart. He was there when she returned, splitting logs with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. His shirt was off, his back slick with sweat, the muscles of his shoulders and arms tensing and releasing like a machine made of breath and sinew. The old Mira would have looked away, ashamed or afraid. But the new Mira, the one with the secret braid, found herself watching, not with desire, but with a sense of wonder. This was the man they feared, this powerful, focused, and utterly peaceful creature. He was not the monster they described. He was something else entirely. He saw her then, and paused, setting the axe down. He gave a single, small nod. It was the first time he had acknowledged her return. She walked past him into the cabin, her heart beating a little faster. On the small table, she opened her palm. Lying there was a single small red bead she had purchased at the post. A tiny, impulsive act of defiance. She held it out to him as he stood in the doorway. He looked at the bead, then at her, then back at the bead. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he did something that made her breath catch. He touched his chest, right over his heart. Then, he pointed to the braid in her hair. A warmth rose to her cheeks. A gift for a gift. An exchange made without a single word. She felt a wave of unexpected softness flood her, a feeling so foreign she didn't know what to do with it. She carefully placed the red bead on the windowsill, next to a chipped porcelain mug her mother had given her. She left it there like a prayer, a small spot of color in her gray world. But just as this fragile trust began to bloom, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was Sheriff Silas, his face grim, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He reined his horse in hard in her yard, his eyes immediately finding the silent man who stood near the woodpile. "Mira," the sheriff said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't dismount. "Step away from him. Now." Mira's blood ran cold. The sheriff wasn't here for a social call. "What is it, Silas?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands had begun to tremble. "You have no idea who you've brought into your home," the sheriff said, his gaze fixed on the man, who had not moved, had not flinched. "They call him the Bear of Craven Hollow for a reason, Mira, and it's not a kind one." The sheriff's words hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Mira looked from Silas's hard, determined face to the silent man by the woodpile. The fragile peace of the last few days shattered into 1,000 pieces. "What reason, Silas?" Mira asked, her voice barely a whisper. The sheriff finally tore his eyes away from the man and looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and stern warning. "He was part of a clan of squatters up on the northern ridge," Silas explained, his voice low. "Caused a lot of trouble, claimed land that wasn't theirs. Last spring there was a dispute, a fire." The sheriff paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "A farmhouse burned to the ground. A family was inside, Mira. A man, his wife, their 2 small children. They didn't make it out." Mira felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at the man who still stood like a statue, his face unreadable. "When we got there," Silas continued, "the whole place was ash and smoke, and he was the only one left standing, in the middle of it all, covered in blood and soot. Wouldn't say a word, hasn't said a word since. He's not just silent, Mira. He's a monster. A killer." The sheriff's accusation echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. A killer. The word felt unreal, a grotesque distortion of the man who had braided her hair with such care. But the town's fear, the whispers, the name itself, it all suddenly clicked into a terrifying new picture. Had she been a fool? Had she mistaken a predator's cunning for gentleness? She looked at his hands, the hands that had mended her fences, split her wood, and soothed the knots from her hair. Could those same hands have set a fire that consumed a family? The doubt was a poison, seeping into the fragile trust she had begun to build. She started, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? "He seems nice? He braided my hair?" It sounded insane even to her own ears. "I'm telling you for your own good," Silas said, his voice softening slightly. "Get rid of him. Send him away before you get hurt, or worse." He gave her one last, long look, then spurred his horse, turning back toward the town and leaving a cloud of dust and fear in his wake. Mira stood frozen in the yard, the sheriff's words ringing in her ears. A killer. She turned and looked at the man. He was watching her now, his dark eyes holding hers for the first time since the auction. There was no anger in his gaze, no defense. There was only that same profound, ancient sadness. He turned, picked up the axe, and with a clean, powerful swing, split another log in two. The sound cracked through the quiet, a punctuation mark on the sheriff's grim story. That night, Mira didn't leave food on the porch. She barred her cabin door for the first time since he'd arrived. She sat in the dark, the red bead on her windowsill seeming to mock her. The braid in her hair felt heavy, like a chain. She watched him through the window as he sat by the barn, a solitary figure against the encroaching darkness. Was his silence guilt? Was his hard work a penance for an unspeakable crime? Sleep would not come. The questions churned in her mind, a relentless storm of fear and confusion. Finally, driven by a desperate need for answers, she unbarred the door and slipped out of the cabin. He had discarded the tattered, filthy clothes he'd been wearing at the auction, and she had, without thinking, put them in an old crate in the barn. Now, she needed to see them again. She needed to look for something, anything, a clue that would either confirm her fears or absolve him. She crept into the barn, the smell of hay and dust filling her lungs. She found the crate and lifted the lid. The clothes were stiff with dirt and dried blood. Her stomach turned, but she forced herself to search. She ran her hands over the rough fabric, through the pockets, feeling for anything that might be hidden. Her fingers brushed against a thick seam in the trousers. There was a lump, something hard and small, stitched deep inside the lining. Her heart pounded as she worked her nails at the thick thread, pulling and tearing until it came loose. She reached into the small hidden pocket and pulled it out. It wasn't a coin, it wasn't a weapon. It was a small object, carved from a piece of pale, smooth wood. It was a bird, a tiny, intricately detailed wren, its head cocked as if listening. Mira gasped, stumbling backward, dropping the carving as if it had burned her. It clattered softly on the barn floor. Her blood ran cold. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar lines of her life suddenly blurring into a terrifying, unrecognizable landscape. She knew this carving. She knew the delicate lines of the wings, the tiny, perfect beak. She had a small wooden box in the chest at the foot of her bed, and it was filled with little birds, all carved exactly like this one. They were made by one person and one person only, her late husband, Levi. The connection was impossible, a monstrous, twisted knot in the fabric of reality. What was a carving made by her dead husband doing hidden in the clothes of the man accused of murder? The man she had bought, brought home, and begun to trust? She snatched the carving from the floor and ran from the barn, her mind reeling. She didn't stop until she was standing in front of him. He looked up from the ground where he sat, his face shadowed in the moonlight. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped in her throat. She simply opened her hand and held out the small, wooden bird. His reaction was everything. His body went rigid. The deep, weary calm in his eyes shattered, replaced by a storm of emotions she couldn't name. Pain, grief, rage. He stared at the wren as if it were a ghost, a specter from a past he had tried to bury. He didn't look confused. He looked haunted. He recoiled from the carving, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat, the first sound she had ever heard him make. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony. The questions that had been tormenting her evaporated, replaced by a single terrifying certainty. This wasn't his story. It was Levi's. The man, his face a mask of torment, scrambled away from the carving. He reached for the fire pit, where a few embers still glowed. He picked up a charred stick, the end of it still warm. His hand was shaking, but his movements were deliberate. He turned to the patch of bare packed earth beside the fire, and he began to draw. He was finally going to tell her what happened. And Mira knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the truth was going to destroy everything she thought she knew about the man she had married, the life she had lived, and the grief she had carried for 2 long years. The tip of the charred stick scraped against the hard-packed earth, the sound scratching at the profound silence of the night. The man, she couldn't think of him as the bear anymore, hunched over his crude canvas, his massive shoulders trembling with the effort of telling a story he had no voice for. First he drew a small, simple square with a triangle on top. A house. Beside it he drew stick figures, a tall one, a shorter one, and 2 very small ones. A family. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking plea for her to understand. He tapped his own chest, then pointed to the drawing of the family. His family. Next to their small house, he drew a much larger one. A sprawling, imposing structure with 2 stories and a wide porch. Mira's breath caught. It was a perfect, simple rendering of the farmhouse she had shared with Levi. He drew a long, jagged line in the dirt between the 2 houses, a boundary, a dispute. His drawings became faster, more urgent. He drew a figure, taller and broader than the others, standing in front of the big house. The figure had an angry, scrawled face and was pointing a demanding finger at the small family. Levi. He was drawing Levi. The man then drew his own father, the tall stick figure, shaking his head. They wouldn't sell, they wouldn't leave. This was their land. The scene in the dirt shifted. The drawings became frantic, violent. He drew more figures now, standing beside Levi, men with torches. The image was unmistakable, a universal symbol of destruction. He drew the torches being thrown, and then he drew the small house engulfed in angry, jagged lines of fire, flames. Mira put a hand to her mouth, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The sheriff's story was true. There had been a fire. But the man wasn't finished. His hand moved with a desperate, furious energy. He drew himself, a larger stick figure, trying to get to the burning house, trying to pull the smaller figures out. But other figures, Levi's men, were holding him back, beating him. He drew fists and clubs raining down on him. And then he drew the final, most horrific image. He drew himself on the ground, and standing over him was the angry figure of Levi. In Levi's hand, he drew a knife. The man looked up from the dirt, his eyes locking with Mira's. They were filled with a terrible, voiceless scream. He pointed the charcoal stick to his own mouth. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he drew a single, brutal line across the mouth of the figure on the ground. A cutting motion. The truth landed not like a feather, but like a building collapsing on top of her. Levi, her husband, the man she had mourned, the man the town remembered as a pillar of the community, strong and fair. He was a monster. He had orchestrated the fire. He had murdered an innocent family because they would not give up their land, and he had personally, brutally, silenced the only witness. He had cut out this man's tongue to ensure the truth would be buried with the ashes of his family. Everything, the accusation, the trial by rumor, the shackles, the auction, it was all a lie. A cruel, elaborate piece of theater designed by her husband to frame an innocent man for his own monstrous crimes. The man wasn't the bear of Craven Hollow because he was a beast. He was the bear because he had survived something that should have killed him, and had carried the unbearable weight of it in silence ever since. Mira stared at the story scrawled in the dirt, a testament of horror written in ash. She looked at the man before her, his body shaking with the memory of it all. This was his name. Creel. That was what his father had called him. The name surfaced in his memory as he drew, a ghost on a tongue that could no longer speak it. Her own grief, the grief she had carried for Levi, felt like a bitter poison in her veins. It curdled, transforming into something else, something cold, hard, and sharp. It transformed into rage, a white-hot, righteous fury that burned away all her fear and confusion. She had been living a lie. Her entire life with Levi, her marriage, her widowhood, it was all built on a foundation of violence and deceit. Creel let the charred stick fall from his trembling fingers. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the telling. Mira stood up, her face set like stone, her eyes blazing in the moonlight. "They will know," she whispered, her voice shaking with an intensity that startled them both. "I swear on my life, Creel, they will all know what he did." She turned and marched back to the cabin, not a victim, not a frightened widow, but a woman with a purpose. She went to the large carved wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the chest that held all of Levi's things, his clothes, his papers, his memories. She had kept it like a shrine. Now, she saw it for what it was, a tomb full of lies. She threw the heavy lid open. The smell of cedar and old wool wafted out. She began to tear through the contents, throwing aside folded shirts and polished boots. She wasn't just looking for proof. She was looking for a weapon. And she knew, somewhere in the dark heart of this chest, she would find it. She would find the words to give Creel his voice back, and she would make them all listen. Her hands, frantic and sure, finally closed around it. Tucked beneath a false bottom she never knew existed was a thick, leather-bound book. It wasn't a Bible or a book of poetry. It was a ledger, Levi's journal, a meticulous, chilling record of his business dealings, his ambitions, his resentments. She took it to the table and opened it under the lamplight. Her eyes flew across the pages, Levi's neat, controlled handwriting a grotesque contrast to the ugliness it described. And there it was, a series of entries from last spring. He never used names. It was always the dispute with the squatters, or the problem on the northern ridge. He wrote of their stubbornness, their refusal to see reason. Then the final, damning entry, dated the day after the fire. Ridge problem has been solved. A permanent solution. The land is clear. Cost of acquisition was high, but the asset is now secure. A permanent solution. The asset is now secure. The cold, clinical words were a confession. Mira slammed the book shut, the sound echoing the closing of a chapter in her life. The chapter of lies. The next morning, she did not wait for Creel to braid her hair. She did it herself, her fingers working with a fierce, newfound purpose. It wasn't as neat as his, but it was strong. As she plaited the dark strands, she threaded the beads he had given her, or rather, that she had bought for him, into the weave. A red bead for the blood he had shed and the blood of his family. A white bead for the innocence that had been stolen from him. She added a new one, a deep blue bead she'd had in her sewing box, for the silent sorrow he had carried for so long. She would find a green one for the new life they would build, and a gold one for the home he now had. It was a war banner, a story woven into her hair for all to see. When she stepped out of the cabin, Creel was standing by the wagon, waiting. He had seen the light in her window all night. He had seen the grim determination on her face when she emerged. He didn't know what her plan was, but when she walked toward him, the leather journal clutched in her hand, he understood. He simply nodded and helped her onto the wagon seat. They rode back into Craven Hollow, not as a frightened widow and her monstrous pet, but as two avengers, two survivors, on a mission for truth. The townsfolk stopped and stared as they passed. The sight of Mira, her face a mask of cold fury, with the bear sitting beside her, not in chains, but as an equal, was enough to silence the entire town. She didn't stop at the trading post. She drove the wagon directly into the center of the square, right in front of the sheriff's office, and pulled the horses to a halt. Sheriff Silas came out, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "Mira, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his eyes wide with alarm. "I told you to get rid of him." "You told me a story, Sheriff," Mira said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, for all to hear. "Now I'm going to tell you the truth." A crowd was gathering, drawn by the commotion. They muttered amongst themselves, pointing at Creel, at Mira. She ignored them. She held up the leather-bound journal. "You all knew my husband, Levi," she called out, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You thought he was a good man, an honest man. You were wrong." She opened the journal, and she began to read. She read the entries about the land dispute. She read the cold, calculating words about the problem that needed a permanent solution. Her voice didn't waver. With every word, she chipped away at the marble statue of Levi's memory, revealing the rotten core beneath. "There was a fire," she said, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the crowd. "A family died. But this man," she put a hand on Creel's arm, "didn't set it. He was a victim, the sole survivor of a massacre orchestrated by my husband, Levi." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas looked pale, his hand falling from his gun. "You want to know why he's silent?" Mira's voice rose, laced with a fury that made even the most hardened men flinch. "You want to know why the great bear of Craven Hollow can't speak? It's because my husband, the man you all admired, took a knife and cut out his tongue to make sure this story would never be told." She told them everything, about the carving, about the story in the dirt. She exposed the full, horrific truth of Levi's crimes, her words a cleansing fire in the town square. She was not just clearing Creel's name, she was liberating herself from the prison of her own grief, burning down the lies she had unknowingly lived. The town was silent, horrified, ashamed. They looked at Creel, not with fear, but with a dawning, terrible understanding. They saw not a beast, but a man who had suffered an unimaginable injustice right under their noses. Mira closed the journal. Her work was done. Without another word, she snapped the reins and the wagon began to move. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock and remorse. They didn't look back. They rode away from the town, away from the lies, away from the ghosts of the past. They rode toward their cabin, toward the garden they had yet to plant, toward the quiet future they would build together from the ashes. When they arrived back at the homestead, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The world felt clean, new. Creel dismounted first. Then he turned, and for the first time he offered her his hands to help her down. It was a simple gesture, but it was profound, an offering of support, of equality. She took his hands. They were large, calloused, and strong. As she slid down from the wagon seat, he didn't let go. He held her hands in his and stepped closer until they were standing face to face. He looked into her eyes, and his were clear of the storm. The sadness was still there, a deep, quiet pool, but the torment was gone. He opened his mouth. A sound came out, raspy and broken from years of disuse, a voice clawing its way back from a tomb of silence. It was just one word, but it was a miracle. Mira. Her name. He had spoken her name. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. The silent man had found his voice, and the first word he chose to speak was hers. In that single, broken word, a new story began. Not a story of survival, but a story of living. And as the last light of day faded, they stood together in the quiet yard, two broken souls made whole, ready to build a home. If you believe that truth can heal even the deepest wounds, and that everyone deserves a voice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that dig deep into the human heart. Tell us in the comments, what is a truth you would fight for? We read every single one. Thank you for listening.